flying is statistically the safest form of travel, with modern aircraft equipped with redundant systems, advanced autopilots, and extensively trained crews. Then there were these pilots, who proved that no amount of technology can fully compensate for human error, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing on an airplane isn't mechanical failure. It's the person holding the controls. Buckle your seatbelts for a masterclass in how not to fly an airplane. 1. In 1983, an Air Canada Boeing 767 ran completely out of fuel at 41,000 feet over Manitoba because the ground crew and pilots made metric conversion errors when calculating fuel. The aircraft's fuel gauges were malfunctioning, so the crew calculated manually, but Canada had recently switched from imperial to metric, and multiple people made errors converting between pounds and kilograms, loading less than half the fuel needed. When both engines flamed out at cruising altitude, the captain, an experienced glider pilot, managed to glide the 132-ton aircraft to a former military airfield in Gimli that had been converted to a drag racing strip hosting a family event. The aircraft touched down while families scattered, and despite the nose gear collapsing, everyone survived. The Gimli glider became famous as an example of both catastrophic calculation errors and remarkable recovery skill. 2. In 2009, two Northwest Airlines pilots flying from San Diego to Minneapolis overflew their destination by 150 miles because they were both distracted by personal laptops and had tuned out all radio communications for over an hour. Controllers tried repeatedly to contact the aircraft as it flew past Minneapolis toward Wisconsin, with military jets preparing to intercept. The pilots finally responded after a flight attendant asked about arrival time, realizing they'd missed their destination while engrossed in their computers. Both pilots lost their licenses, and the incident led to regulations prohibiting personal electronic devices in cockpits. The 144 passengers had no idea their pilots had essentially forgotten they were flying an airplane. 3. In 1978, a United Airlines DC-8 crashed in Portland because the captain became so fixated on a landing gear problem that he forgot to monitor fuel levels and ran all 4 engines dry while circling. The landing gear had made an unusual sound, so the captain circled while troubleshooting. For nearly an hour, the crew focused on the gear while fuel burned away, and despite the flight engineer warning multiple times about critically low fuel, the captain continued circling. All 4 engines flamed out 6 miles from the runway, and the aircraft crashed into a suburban neighborhood, killing 10 people. The landing gear had been functioning normally the entire time. The crash led to crew resource management training that teaches crews to avoid fixation on single problems. 4. In 2013, an Asiana Airlines Boeing 777 crashed at San Francisco because the pilots flew too slowly while relying on automated systems they didn't understand. The crew had disengaged the auto throttle but believed it was still controlling speed. By the time they recognized the aircraft was too slow and too low, recovery was impossible. The plane struck the seawall, cartwheel crashed, and burst into flames. Remarkably, 304 of 307 survived. Investigation revealed the crew had become so dependent on automation that they failed to maintain basic awareness of airspeed and altitude. Fundamental parameters pilots have monitored since aviation began. 5. In 1972, an Eastern Airlines L-1011 crashed into the Florida Everglades because the entire cockpit crew became fixated on a burnt-out landing gear indicator light, while the aircraft descended unnoticed into the swamp. All 3 pilots plus a maintenance specialist were focused on determining whether the gear was down or just the bulb burned out. Nobody noticed the aircraft descending, and it flew into the Everglades, killing 101 of 176 aboard. The burnt-out bulb had been the only problem. The landing gear was fully extended. The crash led to major changes, emphasizing that someone must always monitor flight path regardless of other problems. 6. In 1989, a British Midland Boeing 737 crashed near Kegworth because the pilots shut down the wrong engine after a fan blade failure. When the left engine began vibrating, the pilots believed the right engine was failing. Without verifying, they shut down the right engine, the only working one. Passengers could see flames from the left engine and mentioned this to flight attendants, but this information never reached the cockpit. The damaged left engine failed on final approach, and with both engines inoperative, the aircraft crashed, killing 47 of 126, The incident highlighted critical failures in crew communication and engine identification procedures. 7. In 2005, a Helios Airways Boeing 737 crashed into a Greek mountainside after the entire crew lost consciousness due to hypoxia because a pressurization switch was left wrong during maintenance. When the cabin altitude warning sounded during climb, the pilots confused it with another warning and spent critical minutes troubleshooting the wrong problem while the cabin depressurized. The aircraft continued on autopilot for hours with an unconscious crew, circling Athens while military jets observed pilots slumped in their seats. All 121 aboard died. The accident showed how a simple switch position can cascade into complete disaster. 8. In 1999, American Airlines Flight 1420 crashed at Little Rock during a thunderstorm because the captain pressed ahead despite conditions warranting diversion. The crew made multiple errors during a rushed approach, including failing to arm the spoilers. The aircraft landed fast and long on a wet runway, the spoilers didn't deploy, and the aircraft overran the runway and crashed, killing the captain and 10 passengers. The captain had made comments suggesting determination to land despite deteriorating conditions. A textbook case of get-there-itis overriding sound judgment. 9. In 2001, an American Airlines Airbus A300 crashed in Queens because the first officer made excessive rudder inputs while encountering wake turbulence, snapping the vertical stabilizer off. The first officer made rapid full deflection rudder movements, and the composite stabilizer separated entirely. All 265 aboard died plus 5 on the ground. The accident revealed the rudder system was more sensitive than expected, and that training had emphasized techniques that could overstress the structure. 10. In 2014, an AirAsia Airbus A320 crashed into the Java Sea, killing 162, after the captain's response to a minor maintenance issue caused an uncontrolled climb and stall. Frustrated by repeated alerts, the captain reset computer systems in a way that disconnected the autopilot. The aircraft rolled sharply, and his correction resulted in an extreme climb. The aircraft stalled and fell nearly 30,000 feet in 3 minutes. The captain had used an unauthorized procedure, and his recovery attempts were exactly wrong. 11. In 1997, Korean Air Flight 801 crashed into a hillside in Guam because the captain believed the glide slope was operational when it was out of service. The captain descended without verifying position. Warning systems activated, and the flight engineer called out concerns, but the captain continued. The aircraft struck terrain 3 miles short, killing 228 of 254. Investigation revealed serious cockpit authority problems where junior crew were reluctant to challenge the captain. 12. In 2010, an Air India Express Boeing 737 overran the runway at Mangalore and plunged off a cliff, killing 158 of 166 because the captain continued an unstabilized approach despite multiple warnings. The captain had been sleeping during the flight and appeared disoriented. The first officer called for a go-around 3 times, but the captain continued. The aircraft touched down halfway down the short runway, far too late to stop. The cockpit recorder captured ignored warnings, a tragic case study in violated procedures. 13. In 1982, a British Airways Boeing 747 flew through volcanic ash from Mount Galunggung, causing all 4 engines to flame out at 37,000 feet. The crew hadn't recognized they were in volcanic ash. The aircraft glided without power for 13 minutes before the crew restarted 3 engines and diverted to Jakarta. The captain announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a small problem. All 4 engines have stopped." The incident led to improved volcanic ash procedures, though flying through weather they couldn't assess nearly killed everyone. 14. In 1987, a Northwest Airlines MD-82 crashed after takeoff from Detroit because the crew failed to extend the flaps and didn't notice when the warning system failed to alert them. The aircraft struggled to climb, struck obstacles, and broke apart, killing 154 aboard plus 2 on the ground, with one 4-year-old girl the sole survivor. The crew had rushed through checklists, missing the critical flap setting. A tripped circuit breaker prevented the warning horn. 15. In 2008, a Spanair MD-82 crashed at Madrid for the exact same reason as Detroit 21 years earlier. wrong flap configuration, and failed warning. The aircraft became airborne briefly, then crashed, killing 154 of 172. Despite decades of industry focus after Detroit, the same mistake killed nearly the same number. The crew had been distracted by a maintenance issue and hadn't completed checks. The horrifying repetition demonstrated how identical accidents can recur despite awareness. 16. In 1994, an Aeroflot Airbus A310 crashed in Siberia, killing all 75 people aboard because the captain let his 16-year-old son and 12-year-old daughter sit in the pilot seats and manipulate the controls during cruise flight. While the captain's son was in the left seat, he unknowingly applied enough force to the side stick to partially disconnect the autopilot, allowing the aircraft to enter a steep bank. The autopilot's partial disconnection wasn't clearly enunciated, and by the time the crew realized the aircraft was banking beyond 90 degrees and entering a dive, recovery was impossible. The aircraft entered an uncontrollable spiral dive and crashed, killing everyone including the children in the cockpit. Cockpit voice recorder transcripts revealed the captain's casual attitude toward having his children manipulate controls, not realizing the autopilot design allowed pilot inputs to override automation without clear warning. The accident became an extreme example of cockpit complacency and inappropriate behavior, leading to stricter regulations about cockpit access and control manipulation. 17. In 1992, an El Al Boeing 747 cargo aircraft crashed into an apartment building in Amsterdam after two engines separated from the right wing due to a fatigue failure in the fuse pins that held the engines to the wing. The crew attempted to return to the airport but lost control as the damaged wing's aerodynamics deteriorated. While the initial engine separation wasn't pilot error, investigation revealed the airline's maintenance practices regarding the fuse pin inspections may have been inadequate. The crash killed the 3 crew members, 1 passenger, and 39 people on the ground in the apartment complex, making it one of the deadliest accidents in Dutch history. The pilot's desperate attempts to control an aircraft that was becoming increasingly uncontrollable were captured on radar and radio recordings, showing a crew fighting a losing battle with physics as their aircraft disintegrated around them. 18. In 2015, a Germanwings Airbus A320 was deliberately crashed into the French Alps by the first officer, who locked the captain out of the cockpit and set the autopilot to descend into terrain while 150 people screamed in terror behind him. The first officer had a history of severe depression and had been declared unfit to fly by doctors, but had hidden this information from his employer. When the captain left the cockpit for a bathroom break, the first officer locked the door and programmed the aircraft to descend. For nearly 10 minutes, the captain tried to break through the reinforced cockpit door, which had been strengthened after 9/11 specifically to prevent unauthorized cockpit access, while the first officer sat silently as the aircraft descended into mountains. The crash killed all 150 people aboard and led to requirements that 2 crew members must always be in the cockpit. The incident was technically deliberate rather than a mistake, but the systemic failures that allowed a mentally unfit pilot to fly represented catastrophic errors in aviation safety systems. 19. In 1985, a Japan Airlines Boeing 747 crashed into Mount Osutaka after an improperly repaired rear pressure bulkhead failed, causing explosive decompression that destroyed the aircraft's vertical stabilizer and severed all hydraulic lines. The crew fought for over 30 minutes to control an aircraft that had lost all hydraulic power and was essentially unflyable, using engine thrust as their only means of directional control. Their efforts were heroic but doomed. The aircraft oscillated wildly in phugoid cycles before crashing into the mountain, killing 520 of the 524 people aboard in the deadliest single aircraft accident in history. While the crew's performance during the emergency was later praised, the accident's root cause was a faulty repair made by Boeing 7 years earlier after the aircraft had a tail strike incident. The repair hadn't used enough rows of rivets, creating a fatigue crack that eventually propagated and failed catastrophically at altitude. 20. In 2009, an Air France Airbus A330 crashed into the Atlantic Ocean, killing all 228 people aboard after the pilots lost situational awareness during a high-altitude stall that lasted nearly 4 minutes. Ice crystals had blocked the aircraft's pitot tubes, providing erroneous airspeed readings that caused the autopilot to disconnect. In the confusion, the first officer pulled back on his side stick, putting the aircraft into a climb that bled off airspeed until the wings stalled. Despite stall warnings sounding for most of the 4-minute descent from 38,000 feet, the crew never recognized they were stalled and continued pulling back on the controls. Exactly the wrong input for stall recovery, which requires pushing forward to lower the nose and regain airspeed. The captain was on a rest break when the emergency began and returned to find a hopelessly confused situation he couldn't resolve in time. The crash exposed serious issues with pilot training for high-altitude stall recognition and recovery, and with Airbus's side-stick design that allowed the two pilots to make conflicting inputs without either realizing what the other was doing. 21. In 2013, a UPS Airbus A300 crashed short of the runway in Birmingham, Alabama, because the crew flew an unstabilized approach below the proper glide path and failed to go around despite multiple warning systems alerting them to terrain proximity. The crew had received incorrect information about the approach and had difficulty configuring the aircraft properly, falling below the correct approach path. Ground proximity warnings sounded repeatedly in the final seconds, but the crew didn't react quickly enough to avoid hitting trees and terrain short of the runway. Both pilots were killed. Investigation revealed fatigue was a significant factor, as both pilots had been awake for nearly 18 hours and were flying during their normal sleep period. The accident contributed to major changes in cargo airline duty time regulations, which had previously been less restrictive than passenger airline rules. 22. In 1996, a Bergenair Boeing 757 crashed into the ocean shortly after takeoff from the Dominican Republic because a wasp had built a nest inside one of the aircraft's pitot tubes, while the plane sat unused for weeks, providing erroneous airspeed readings to the captain's instruments. The captain's airspeed indicator showed increasing speed while the first officer's showed decreasing speed, and the crew couldn't determine which was correct. The captain believed his instruments and climbed aggressively while the aircraft actually decelerated toward a stall. When the stick shaker activated warning of an impending stall, the crew responded incorrectly, and the aircraft stalled and crashed into the sea, killing all 189 people aboard. The accident demonstrated how a tiny insect could disable a modern jetliner and highlighted the importance of covering pitot tubes during extended ground storage, a simple maintenance step that wasn't performed. 23. In 1995, an American Airlines Boeing 757 crashed into a mountain near Cali, Colombia, because the crew programming the flight management computer accidentally flew toward the wrong navigation beacon. During a rushed descent, the captain typed in a single letter identifier, R, that he believed corresponded to a beacon near Cali, but the flight management computer selected a different beacon with the same identifier located near Bogota, over 100 miles away in the wrong direction. The aircraft turned away from the airport and toward mountains. When ground proximity warnings sounded, the crew attempted to climb but failed to retract the speed brakes, which reduced climb performance enough that the aircraft struck the mountain, killing 159 of 163 people aboard. The accident led to significant changes in flight management computer design and display formats to prevent similar navigational confusion. 24. In 1972, a Uruguayan Air Force plane carrying a rugby team crashed into the Andes Mountains after the pilots incorrectly believed they had crossed the mountain range when they were still flying among the peaks in poor visibility. The crew had descended below the clouds expecting to see flat terrain on the Chilean side of the mountains, but they were still over high peaks. The aircraft struck a mountain and crashed, initially killing 12 of the 45 people aboard. The 33 survivors endured 72 days in freezing conditions before rescue, surviving only by eating the flesh of those who had died. While the accident resulted from navigation error in challenging conditions, the survival story became one of history's most famous tales of human endurance, later documented in the book and film Alive. The pilot's decision to descend through clouds over mountainous terrain without positive confirmation of their position represented a fundamental navigation error that nearly killed everyone aboard. 25. In 1988, an Aloha Airlines Boeing 737 suffered explosive decompression when a large section of the fuselage roof separated in flight due to fatigue damage the airline's maintenance program had failed to detect. The aircraft had accumulated an exceptionally high number of flight cycles operating short island-hopping routes in Hawaii's salt air environment, and corrosion combined with fatigue to cause the structural failure. One flight attendant was swept out of the aircraft and killed, but the pilots managed to land the severely damaged aircraft safely despite having an open cabin exposed to the slipstream at 24,000 feet. Photographs of the aircraft after landing, showing the cabin open to the sky like a convertible car, became some of the most famous images in aviation safety history. While the pilot's recovery was heroic, the accident exposed serious deficiencies in how the airline and the FAA monitored aging aircraft for fatigue damage. 26. In 2000, an Alaska Airlines MD-83 crashed into the Pacific Ocean after the horizontal stabilizer jack screw failed due to inadequate maintenance and lubrication, causing the stabilizer to jam and then suddenly move to an extreme position. The crew fought for control as the aircraft pitched wildly, at one point flying inverted. They attempted to return to Los Angeles but lost control completely when the damaged stabilizers separated from the aircraft. All 88 people aboard were killed when the aircraft plunged into the ocean near Point Mugu, California. Investigation revealed the airline had extended maintenance intervals on the jack screw beyond manufacturer recommendations, and the threads had worn to the point of failure. The captain and first officer's efforts to control the aircraft during its final minutes were later praised as exceptional airmanship in an ultimately unrecoverable situation caused by maintenance failures rather than piloting errors. 27. In 1989, a U.S. Air Boeing 737 crashed during takeoff from LaGuardia Airport in New York, after the crew lost control when the aircraft suddenly veered left, ran off the runway, through a fence, and into the East River where it broke apart. The captain had noticed an abnormal rudder indication before takeoff, but elected to continue rather than abort and troubleshoot the problem. During the takeoff roll, the rudder moved uncommanded to an extreme position, causing the aircraft to swerve uncontrollably. 27 of 63 people aboard died, many drowning after surviving the initial crash into the frigid water. The captain's decision to continue takeoff despite a known abnormality became a textbook example of how schedule pressure and get-there-itis can lead pilots to ignore warning signs that should prompt them to stop and investigate. 28. In 2019, an Ethiopian Airlines Boeing 737 MAX crashed shortly after takeoff from Addis Ababa, killing all 157 people aboard, when the same automated system that had caused a Lion air crash 5 months earlier again pushed the aircraft's nose down repeatedly until the pilots lost control. The MCAS system had been activated by a faulty angle of attack sensor and forced the nose down dozens of times, while the crew struggled to understand what was happening and maintain control. Boeing had not fully disclosed the MCAS system's existence to pilots or airlines, and the training materials didn't explain how to handle runaway MCAS activations. Combined with the earlier Lion air crash that killed 189 people under nearly identical circumstances, the two accidents killed 346 people and led to the worldwide grounding of the 737 MAX fleet for nearly 2 years. While technical design flaws and inadequate training materials shared blame, the accidents also highlighted how even experienced pilots can be overwhelmed by automation they don't understand and haven't been trained to handle. 29. In 1978, a Pacific Southwest Airlines Boeing 727 collided with a small Cessna over San Diego, after both aircraft failed to see each other despite multiple warnings from air traffic control. The airline pilots had reported the Cessna in sight earlier but lost visual contact and didn't inform controllers they had lost the traffic. Meanwhile, the Cessna pilot was navigating without proper attention to the airspace he was entering. The 727 descended into the Cessna, killing all 135 people on both aircraft, plus 7 on the ground. The accident was the deadliest in California history and led directly to major reforms in air traffic control procedures, the creation of terminal control areas, now Class B airspace, around major airports, and requirements for collision avoidance systems on airliners. The accident demonstrated how miscommunication and lost visual contact in busy airspace could result in catastrophic collision, even with controllers watching. 30. In 1991, a United Airlines Boeing 737 crashed near Colorado Springs, killing all 25 people aboard when the aircraft suddenly rolled and dove into the ground with no apparent warning during approach. For years, investigators couldn't determine what caused the crash until a similar accident in 1994 involving a US Air 737 at Pittsburgh. Both accidents were eventually attributed to a flaw in the Boeing 737 rudder control system that could cause the rudder to move opposite to pilot commands under certain conditions. A rudder hardover that would cause the aircraft to roll uncontrollably. While not strictly pilot error, the accidents revealed that pilots had no effective means of recovering from uncommanded rudder movements, and the design flaw had been present in thousands of 737s for decades without Boeing or the FAA recognizing the danger. The fix required redesigning the 737 rudder control system. 31. In 2006, a Comair regional jet crashed on takeoff from Lexington, Kentucky, killing 49 of 50 people aboard because the crew took off from the wrong runway, one that was far too short for their aircraft. The pilots had taxied to runway 26 instead of runway 22, apparently confused by construction and unfamiliar airport layout and darkness. Runway 26 was only about 3,500 feet long, roughly half the length needed for the aircraft to safely take off. The jet couldn't gain enough speed to fly in the available distance, overran the runway, crashed through a perimeter fence, and struck trees. The sole survivor was the first officer, who was seriously injured. The airport's lone air traffic controller had turned away from his radar screen to perform administrative duties and didn't notice the aircraft lining up on the wrong runway. The accident led to major changes in runway marking, airport signage, and procedures for verifying takeoff runway. 32. In 2020, a Pakistan International Airlines Airbus A320 crashed into a residential area of Karachi on approach to the airport, killing 97 of 99 people aboard plus one person on the ground. Investigation revealed the pilots had attempted to land with the landing gear still retracted. The wheels weren't down. The aircraft struck the runway on its engines, damaging them severely, and the crew attempted a go-around that the damaged engines couldn't sustain. The aircraft crashed into homes about a mile from the airport on the second approach attempt. Both pilots had apparently been distracted discussing the coronavirus pandemic, rather than completing landing checklists, and multiple warnings about the gear not being down were ignored. The accident represented a shocking failure of basic airmanship. Landing gear deployment is among the most fundamental items on any landing checklist, and multiple warnings should have alerted the crew long before touchdown. 33. In 1992, a Chinese Southern Airlines Boeing 737 crashed on approach to Guilin, China, killing all 141 people aboard after the captain pushed the control column forward so aggressively that items in the cockpit became momentarily weightless and the aircraft exceeded its maximum operating speed in a dive toward terrain. The captain had become upset about an autopilot issue, and his aggressive control input was likely unintentional, resulting from frustration rather than deliberate action. The aircraft dove from 7,000 feet to impact in about 26 seconds, striking a hillside at extreme speed. The cockpit voice recorder captured the first officer's confused reaction as the aircraft suddenly pitched into a steep dive, with neither pilot able to recover before ground impact. The accident demonstrated how aggressive physical inputs during moments of frustration can cause catastrophic loss of control. 34. In 2004, a Flash Airlines Boeing 737 crashed into the Red Sea shortly after takeoff from Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, killing all 148 people aboard, when the captain became spatially disoriented while flying over the featureless dark water at night and entered a steep bank that he didn't recognize. The aircraft rolled to nearly 90 degrees of bank and began descending rapidly, but the captain apparently believed he was flying straight and level, and made control inputs that worsened the situation. The first officer recognized the problem and called out the bank angle repeatedly, but either couldn't take control from the disoriented captain or hesitated to do so. The aircraft crashed into the sea at high speed. The accident was a classic case of spatial disorientation, where a pilot's inner ear provides false signals about aircraft orientation that conflict with instruments, combined with authority gradient issues that prevented the first officer from effectively intervening. 35. In 2003, an Air Algérie Boeing 737 crashed immediately after takeoff from Tamanrasset, Algeria, killing 102 of 103 people aboard, when the number 1 engine failed during the takeoff roll and the crew made control inputs that caused them to lose control of the aircraft rather than following standard engine failure procedures. The captain apparently became confused about which engine had failed and may have reduced power on the wrong engine. The aircraft lifted off, rolled sharply, struck the ground, and cartwheeled across the desert. The sole survivor was a soldier who was somehow thrown clear and protected from the fire. Investigation revealed the crew had not followed standard engine failure procedures and had made control inputs inconsistent with the emergency they were experiencing. The accident demonstrated how confusion during a critical emergency can lead to incorrect responses that make survivable situations fatal. 36. In 1997, a Silk Air Boeing 737 dove vertically into a river in Indonesia at supersonic speed, killing all 104 people aboard. While officially the cause remains undetermined, evidence strongly suggested the captain deliberately crashed the aircraft, possibly by disconnecting the flight recorders and pushing the nose down while the first officer was out of the cockpit. The aircraft exceeded the speed of sound during the dive, something a 737 was never designed to do, and impact forces were so extreme that the aircraft disintegrated. If the crash was deliberate, it would represent one of the first known cases of pilot suicide, taking an airliner down with passengers, predating similar tragedies on Egypt Air in 1999, Lam Mozambique in 2013, and Germanwings in 2015. 37. In 2018, a Southwest Airlines Boeing 737 suffered an uncontained engine failure when a fan blade broke loose and debris shattered a cabin window, causing explosive decompression and partially sucking a passenger out of the aircraft. The woman died from her injuries, the only fatality in Southwest Airlines' history. While the engine failure itself wasn't pilot error, the crew's handling of the emergency was widely praised as the captain brought the severely damaged aircraft to a safe landing in Philadelphia despite the catastrophic damage and decompression. The captain, Tammy Jo Schultz, was a former Navy fighter pilot whose calm handling of the emergency was captured on air traffic control recordings and made her a national hero. The incident demonstrated both the dangers of catastrophic engine failure and how skilled pilots can successfully handle emergencies that would overwhelm less experienced crews. 38. In 1985, a Delta Airlines Lockheed L-1011 crashed during approach to Dallas-Fort Worth Airport after flying through a microburst, a powerful localized downdraft that slammed the aircraft into the ground short of the runway, killing 137 of 163 people aboard plus one person on the ground. The crew had elected to continue their approach despite a severe thunderstorm near the airport, a decision that placed them directly in the path of the microburst. Wind shear and microbursts were poorly understood at the time, and the pilots had no warning of the extreme conditions they were entering. The aircraft went from normal approach to ground impact in about 10 seconds, with the crew having almost no time to react. The accident led to major research into wind shear detection and avoidance, and installation of wind shear warning systems at airports and on aircraft. 39. In 2014, a Trans-Asia ATR-72 crashed into a river in Taipei shortly after takeoff after the crew shut down the wrong engine following a flameout on the other engine. When the number 2 engine lost power automatically due to a mechanical problem, the flight crew inexplicably shut down the number 1 engine, the only working one, leaving them with no thrust from either engine. The captain realized the error and attempted to restart the functioning engine, but there wasn't enough altitude to recover. The aircraft descended rapidly, clipping a highway overpass and a taxi, before crashing into the Keelung River. Of 58 people aboard, 43 were killed. Dashcam footage captured the dramatic final moments as the aircraft passed inverted directly over the highway, narrowly missing vehicles. The crew's decision to shut down their only working engine remains inexplicable given their training and the cockpit indications available to them. 40. In 1990, an Avianca Boeing 707 ran out of fuel and crashed in Cove Neck, New York, killing 73 of 158 people aboard, because the crew failed to clearly communicate to air traffic control that they were experiencing a fuel emergency. The flight from Colombia had encountered multiple delays due to weather at JFK Airport and had held in patterns far longer than their fuel reserves allowed. Despite dangerously low fuel, the first officer, whose English was better than the captain's, never used the word emergency or mayday in communications with controllers, instead saying they were running low on fuel. Air traffic control didn't recognize the severity of the situation and continued normal sequencing. The aircraft ran out of fuel on approach and all 4 engines flamed out just moments before touchdown. The crash led to increased emphasis on clear communication of emergencies and standardized phraseology, with minimum fuel and emergency fuel defined clearly in pilot and controller procedures. 41. In 1952, a Bivouac de Havilland Comet became the first commercial jet airliner to crash when it disintegrated over the Mediterranean Sea, killing all 43 people aboard. The investigation ultimately revealed that the square windows of the early Comet design created stress concentration points that led to metal fatigue and catastrophic structural failure at altitude. 2 more Comets broke up in flight before the fleet was grounded and the cause identified. While not pilot error, the crashes fundamentally changed how aircraft structures are designed and tested, leading to the rounded windows seen on all modern airliners. The Comet disasters effectively ended British dominance of the commercial aviation industry and allowed Boeing to capture the market with the better-engineered 707. 42. In 2019, an Atlas Air Boeing 767 cargo aircraft crashed into a bay near Houston, Texas, killing all 3 people aboard when the first officer inadvertently activated the go-around switches while the aircraft was descending, causing automatic systems to increase engine thrust dramatically. Startled by the sudden thrust increase and nose-up pitch, the first officer pushed the control column forward forcefully, overriding the autopilot and putting the aircraft into a dive. The captain, equally surprised, was unable to recover before the aircraft struck the water at high speed. Investigation revealed the first officer had a history of training difficulties and performance problems that previous employers hadn't disclosed to Atlas Air. The accident highlighted ongoing issues with pilot screening, training record sharing between airlines, and pilots who may appear qualified on paper but lack instinctive airmanship skills. 43. In 1983, Korean Airlines Flight 007, a Boeing 747 carrying 269 people, was shot down by Soviet interceptors after straying hundreds of miles into Soviet airspace due to a navigation error. The crew had apparently failed to properly engage the inertial navigation system, causing the aircraft to fly on a constant magnetic heading that gradually diverged from the planned route. The deviation was so significant that the aircraft flew over sensitive Soviet military installations on the Kamchatka Peninsula and Sakhalin Island. Soviet interceptors were scrambled and, after failed attempts to contact the aircraft, shot it down with air-to-air missiles. All 269 people aboard were killed. The tragedy led directly to President Reagan's decision to make the GPS satellite navigation system available for civilian use, and to major changes in how crews verify navigation system programming before flight. 44. In 2006, a Gol Transportes Aéreos Boeing 737 collided with an Embraer Legacy business jet over the Amazon rainforest after the business jet's transponder was inadvertently switched off, making it invisible to the 737's collision avoidance system. The Legacy's pilots had accidentally bumped the transponder switch without noticing, and Brazilian air traffic control failed to detect the resulting conflict. The aircraft collided at 37,000 feet, shearing the wing off the 737, which crashed into the jungle, killing all 154 aboard. The Legacy, though damaged, landed safely with all 7 aboard surviving. The Legacy pilots were initially charged with negligent operation in Brazil and faced years of legal proceedings before eventually being convicted of negligence but avoiding prison. The accident exposed significant deficiencies in Brazilian air traffic control and highlighted how a single inadvertent switch activation could defeat multiple layers of safety systems. 45. And finally, there's the 2018 Lion Air Boeing 737 MAX crash that killed 189 people because a faulty sensor triggered a new automated system called MKEs that pilots had never been trained on and didn't know existed. The angle of attack sensor had been damaged, providing false readings that told the MCAS system the aircraft's nose was too high. MCAS responded by repeatedly pushing the nose down, and despite the crew's desperate efforts to counteract the system, they couldn't understand why their aircraft kept diving and eventually lost control. The aircraft crashed into the Java Sea just minutes after takeoff. Boeing had chosen not to include detailed MCAS information in pilot training materials, believing the system would operate transparently in the background. Instead, pilots faced an emergency they had no training to handle, fighting an automated system they didn't know existed for control of their aircraft. Combined with the nearly identical Ethiopian Airlines crash 5 months later that killed another 157 people under the same circumstances, the two 737 MAX crashes killed 346 people and exposed fundamental problems with how aviation regulators certify new aircraft systems and how manufacturers communicate critical safety information to pilots. The accidents led to the longest grounding of a commercial aircraft in history, billions of dollars in losses for Boeing, criminal charges against the company, and a fundamental reevaluation of the relationship between automation and pilot authority in modern aircraft. The pilots who died fighting a system they didn't know existed became symbols of how technological complexity, inadequate training, and corporate cost-cutting can combine to create disasters that should have been prevented, and their crashes changed aviation safety practices around the world. Here's the brutal truth about aviation. Flying is remarkably safe because of multiple redundant systems, rigorous training, and decades of learning from past mistakes. But these accidents prove that human error remains aviation's greatest vulnerability, that even the best trained professionals can make catastrophic mistakes under pressure, and that the margin between routine flight and disaster can be as small as a wrong switch position, a moment of distraction, or a failure to communicate clearly. The real flight path was the safety lessons that were written in tragedy along the way. Every crash in this list led to changes in procedures, training, or technology designed to prevent the same mistake from killing again. But the cost of those lessons, paid in thousands of lives, serves as a permanent reminder that complacency in the cockpit can be fatal. Want to know the most important thing you can do as an airline passenger? Nothing. The crews flying you are trained for emergencies you can't imagine, and every flight benefits from decades of hard-won safety improvements. But next time you fly and everything goes smoothly, remember that routine flight exists because people died, learning what could go wrong, and other people dedicated their careers to making sure it wouldn't happen again. Subscribe if you appreciate uneventful flights, and remember that the most boring flight you ever take is actually the greatest triumph of aviation safety. Thousands of potential failure points managed successfully by professionals who learned from every disaster that came before them.